In 1990, 18-year-old Amelia Evans walked out of her family's Oregon home and vanished without a trace. For 22 years, her parents Frank and Clara lived in a purgatory of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Then, while cleaning out their daughter's untouched bedroom, Frank discovered something that would shatter everything they thought they knew about her disappearance. Hidden within the pages of an old yearbook was a cryptic note that would lead them into a web of obsession, betrayal, and secrets darker than they ever imagined possible. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The rain drummed against the windows of the Evans house with a persistence that matched the ache in Frank's chest. 22 years had passed since that October morning when 18-year-old Amelia had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions that gnawed at his soul like hungry wolves. The gray Oregon sky seemed to mirror the perpetual overcast that had settled over their lives, a suffocating blanket of uncertainty that never lifted. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now streaked with silver, fell in tired waves around a face that had aged decades in the span of 2. The laugh lines around her eyes had deepened into permanent creases of worry, and her shoulders carried the invisible weight of a mother's worst nightmare. She stared at the rain-streaked window, watching droplets race down the glass like the tears she had cried until there were none left. "We can't keep living like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's symphony. "The room. It's like a shrine to our pain. Maybe it's time." Frank looked up from his untouched breakfast, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his fork. His dark eyes, once sharp and determined, now held the haunted quality of a man who had stared into an abyss for too long. The stubble on his jaw was more gray than brown, and deep lines etched his face like a roadmap of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. The room at the end of the hallway had remained untouched since that terrible day. Amelia's bedroom existed in a state of suspended animation, preserved exactly as she had left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books remained stacked on the nightstand, and her bed was still unmade from that final morning when she had rushed out for what they thought was just another day at college. With hearts heavy as lead, they climbed the stairs together. Each step echoed through the house like a funeral march, their footsteps marking time with the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Frank's hand hesitated on the brass doorknob, his knuckles white with the effort of simply turning it. The familiar scent of Amelia's vanilla perfume still lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of sweetness that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The room was exactly as they remembered it. Sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, casting long shadows across faded posters of bands and movie stars from a different era. Amelia's desk sat cluttered with notebooks and pens, as if she might return at any moment to finish her homework. Her favorite teddy bear, Mr. Patches, sat propped against her pillows, his button eyes seeming to watch them with silent accusation. Frank moved through the space like a man walking through quicksand, each object a potential landmine of memory. Clara began folding clothes with mechanical precision, her movements robotic as she tried to distance herself from the emotional weight of each garment. A sweater Amelia had worn to her high school graduation, the jeans with paint stains from her art class. Each piece of fabric held echoes of their daughter's laughter, her dreams, her vibrant spirit that had been extinguished too soon. As Frank carefully lifted books from the nightstand, his fingers brushed against something he had forgotten existed. Buried beneath layers of dust and neglect was Amelia's senior yearbook, its navy blue cover embossed with gold lettering that read, "Riverside High School, Class of 1990. The book felt heavier than it should have, weighted down by memories and significance that Frank had been too broken to face. His hands shook as he opened the cover, and immediately he was transported back to a time when their biggest worry was whether Amelia would get into her first-choice college. The dedication page was filled with Amelia's careful handwriting, listing thanks to teachers, friends, and family. Her penmanship was neat and precise, each letter formed with the deliberate care of someone who believed they had all the time in the world. As Frank turned the pages, faces from the past stared back at him. Young, hopeful faces of classmates who had graduated and moved on with their lives while Amelia remained frozen in time. He found her senior portrait, and his breath caught. She looked so young, so impossibly alive, her smile radiant and her eyes bright with the promise of a future that would never come. It was on page 147 that Frank's world shifted on its axis. Tucked between the pages like a pressed flower was a small piece of notebook paper, folded into a perfect square. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges soft and worn as if it had been handled many times. With trembling fingers, Frank unfolded the note, revealing Amelia's name written in unfamiliar handwriting across the top. The message was brief, but loaded with meaning that hit Frank like a physical blow. Amy, don't forget about the tape, the last song. Don't lose it. It's more important than you know. Love always, Bethany. The words swam before Frank's eyes as the significance crashed over him like a tidal wave. The tape. He remembered it clearly now, a birthday gift he had given Amelia just months before she disappeared. It was a compilation of her favorite songs, carefully curated and recorded with the love only a father could pour into such a simple gesture. He had spent hours at the stereo, adjusting levels and timing, wanting everything to be perfect for his little girl. But the tape had never been found among Amelia's belongings. The police had searched her room meticulously, cataloging every item, every possible clue. The absence of the tape had been noted but dismissed as insignificant. After all, cassette tapes were easily lost or loaned out. But Bethany's note suggested otherwise. It implied that the tape held secrets, mysteries that might finally unlock the truth about what happened to his daughter. Frank's mind raced as he tried to recall everything he knew about Bethany Reed. She had been Amelia's closest friend since childhood, a quiet girl with serious eyes and a gentle smile. After Amelia's disappearance, Bethany had been questioned extensively by police, but she had seemed genuinely devastated and claimed to know nothing about her friend's whereabouts. The girls had been inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams the way only teenage best friends could. The note changed everything. It suggested that Bethany knew more than she had revealed, that there were layers to this mystery that had never been explored. Frank felt a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced in years: hope, determination, and a burning need for answers that threatened to consume him. Clara appeared beside him, drawn by his sudden stillness. When she saw the note in his hands, her face went pale, and she sank onto Amelia's bed, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Together, they read the message again and again, searching for hidden meanings, for clues that might have been overlooked. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the dusty bedroom, something had fundamentally shifted. After 22 years of stagnant grief, they finally had a direction, a thread to pull that might unravel the mystery of their daughter's disappearance. Frank folded the note carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart, where it felt like a talisman of hope. The coastal town of Seal Harbor emerged from the morning mist, like a watercolor painting bleeding into reality. Frank's rental car navigated the winding roads that hugged the rocky coastline, each turn revealing glimpses of a Pacific Ocean that stretched endlessly toward a horizon shrouded in gray. The salty air carried the scent of seaweed and something indefinable that spoke of secrets buried beneath the waves. After 3 days of searching through old records and making countless phone calls, he had finally tracked down Bethany Reed to this remote sanctuary where she had apparently sought refuge from the world. The address led him to a weathered cottage perched precariously on a bluff overlooking the churning sea. Paint peeled from its cedar shingles like old skin, and wild roses had grown over the picket fence in chaotic abundance, their thorns creating a natural barrier between the house and the outside world. Wind chimes made from driftwood and shells hung from the covered porch, creating a melancholy melody that seemed to harmonize with the eternal song of the crashing waves below. Frank's legs felt unsteady as he approached the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he wondered if it might simply give out from the strain. 22 years of suppressed hope and buried desperation had crystallized into this single moment. His finger hesitated over the doorbell, a simple brass button that seemed to hold the weight of his entire future. When the door finally opened, Frank barely recognized the woman standing before him. Bethany Reed had been a vibrant teenager with bright eyes and an infectious laugh. But the woman who peered at him through the crack in the door looked as if life had systematically drained every ounce of joy from her being. Her once golden hair hung in limp strands around a face that was gaunt and pale, marked by premature lines that spoke of sleepless nights and hidden torments. Her eyes, once sparkling with mischief and warmth, now held the wary distance of a wounded animal. Recognition dawned slowly in those haunted eyes, followed immediately by something that looked disturbingly like fear. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, knuckles going white as she steadied herself against what appeared to be a physical blow. The color drained from her already pale cheeks, leaving her looking ghostly against the dark interior of her cottage. Frank watched as a tremor ran through her slight frame, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. She pressed one hand to her chest, as if trying to hold her heart in place, while the other clutched the doorframe with desperate intensity. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the distant cry of seagulls and the rhythmic percussion of waves against the rocks far below. Inside the cottage, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of lavender and old paper, as if Bethany had surrounded herself with things that spoke of peace and permanence. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with volumes whose spines showed the wear of frequent reading. Handmade quilts draped over worn furniture, and dried flowers hung from exposed beams, creating an environment that felt like a sanctuary, built against the harsh realities of the outside world. Bethany moved through her home with the careful precision of someone who had learned to control every aspect of their environment. Her hands shook as she prepared tea, the delicate china cups rattling against their saucers with each tremor. When she finally spoke about the tape, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon demons she had spent decades trying to keep at bay. The revelation came in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a truth too painful to view whole. Amelia had indeed made a secret recording, but it was not the innocent collection of favorite songs that Frank had imagined. His daughter had been clever, far more perceptive than anyone had given her credit for. She had suspected something was wrong with Marcus Cole, her boyfriend, and had decided to document one of their conversations without his knowledge. Frank felt the blood drain from his face as Bethany described how Amelia had hidden her tape recorder beneath her jacket during what would turn out to be their final argument. The conversation had been tense, charged with an undercurrent of fear that Amelia had recognized, but not fully understood. Marcus had been agitated, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. The truth that Bethany revealed next hit Frank like a physical blow to the chest. Marcus Cole, the young man the police had questioned and ultimately dismissed as a suspect, had been living under the crushing weight of blackmail. The puppet master pulling his strings was someone Frank had never considered, someone who had moved through their lives like a benign presence while harboring dark intentions beneath a facade of respectability. Mr. Gregory Grayson, Amelia's music teacher and a man Frank had trusted with his daughter's artistic development, had been systematically exploiting his position of authority. The man who had praised Amelia's voice and encouraged her musical aspirations had been using his knowledge of Marcus's secrets as leverage, forcing the young man into increasingly compromising situations. Bethany's voice broke as she described how Amelia had slowly begun to piece together the sinister puzzle. Her daughter had noticed Marcus's strange behavior, his sudden mood swings, and his desperate attempts to avoid certain places and people. With the intuitive understanding that sometimes comes with deep emotional connection, Amelia had recognized that her boyfriend was trapped in something far beyond teenage drama. Frank's world tilted on its axis as he realized that the investigation 22 years ago had barely scratched the surface of what had really been happening. The police had focused on the obvious suspects and conventional motives, never imagining that a respected educator might be capable of such manipulation. Mr. Grayson had been interviewed as part of the routine questioning of Amelia's teachers, but his sterling reputation and apparent concern for his missing student had placed him above suspicion. The cottage seemed to grow smaller as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Frank could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, and his vision began to blur around the edges as rage and grief warred within his chest. For 22 years, he had lived with the torture of not knowing, while the man responsible had continued his life, perhaps even thriving in his career, building success on the foundation of his daughter's silence. Bethany's tears fell freely now, carving tracks down her pale cheeks as she confessed her own burden of guilt. She had known about the tape's true contents, had understood its significance, but fear had kept her silent. The weight of that knowledge had driven her to this isolated existence, this self-imposed exile from a world where she could no longer distinguish between safety and threat. The research consumed Frank for 3 sleepless days. His kitchen table became a war room scattered with printouts, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Gregory Grayson had transformed from a small-town music teacher into a successful record producer, his name attached to platinum albums and Grammy nominations. His company, Grayson Records, occupied a gleaming glass tower in downtown Portland, a monument to success built on what Frank now suspected was a foundation of darkness. The elevator to the 32nd floor moved with silent efficiency, but Frank's stomach churned with each ascending floor. His palms were slick with sweat as he clutched a manila folder containing fabricated credentials identifying him as Robert Fletcher, a former student seeking career advice. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but desperation had taught him that sometimes truth required deception as its vehicle. Grayson's office was a shrine to his own success. Gold and platinum records adorned the walls like trophies, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city sprawling below. The man himself had aged well, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit tailored to perfection. But Frank noticed details that others might miss. The slight tremor in Grayson's hands as he poured coffee, the way his eyes darted toward the door even during casual conversation, and most tellingly, the prescription bottles partially hidden behind a framed photograph on his desk. When Frank carefully steered the conversation toward his supposed memories of Riverside High School, Grayson's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. His smile became more forced, his responses more calculated. The change was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent 22 years analyzing every detail, every nuance that might provide a clue to his daughter's fate. The mention of Amelia Evans caused a visible reaction that Grayson tried desperately to hide. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and a muscle in his jaw twitched, as if he were physically restraining himself from speaking. His eyes, previously warm and engaging, became cold and calculating, studying Frank with the intensity of a predator assessing potential threat. Frank felt his own pulse quicken as he watched Grayson's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. When he casually mentioned the tape titled "The Last Song," the effect was electric. Grayson's face went pale beneath his artificial tan, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. The successful producer's hands betrayed him, trembling as he set down his coffee cup with such force that the liquid sloshed over the rim, staining important documents on his mahogany desk. The transformation was complete when Grayson stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a sharp crack. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the smooth baritone of a man accustomed to commanding respect. Instead, it carried the harsh edge of barely controlled panic, each word delivered with increasing aggression as he demanded to know who Frank really was and what he wanted. Frank had expected denial, perhaps even dismissal, but the raw hostility radiating from Grayson confirmed every suspicion that had been building in his chest. This was not the reaction of an innocent man being asked about a long-ago student. This was the desperate fury of someone whose carefully buried secrets were being excavated by an unwelcome archaeologist of truth. The meeting ended with Grayson physically escorting Frank from the building, his grip on Frank's arm tight enough to leave bruises. In the elevator, Grayson's breathing was labored, and beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the building's efficient air conditioning. His eyes held a wild quality that Frank recognized from his own darkest moments, the look of a man being driven to the edge of reason by forces beyond his control. Outside in the parking garage, Frank's hands shook as he sat in his car, trying to process what had just occurred. The confrontation had revealed more than he had dared hope, but it had also awakened something predatory in Grayson that made Frank's skin crawl with primitive warning signals. He knew he should drive away, return to Clara, and turn this information over to the police. But 22 years of questions demanded more immediate answers. When Grayson's black Mercedes emerged from the underground garage, Frank made a decision that would have terrified his younger, more cautious self. He followed at a distance, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that he hadn't felt since Amelia's disappearance had first consumed his life. The city gradually gave way to suburbs, then to rural roads that wound through dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The Mercedes climbed steadily into the Cascade Mountains, following roads that became increasingly narrow and isolated. Frank maintained his distance, using the curves and elevation changes to stay hidden while keeping Grayson's vehicle in sight. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of shadow and brightness that seemed to mirror his own emotional state. alternating between clarity and confusion. After nearly 2 hours of driving, Grayson's car disappeared down a barely visible dirt road, marked only by a rusty mailbox and overgrown with blackberry vines. Frank waited 15 agonizing minutes before following, his rental car bouncing over ruts and potholes that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The track ended at a clearing where a log cabin sat like a malignant growth among the towering trees. The structure was older than Frank had expected, its logs dark with age and weather. Moss crept up the foundation, and the windows were grimy with years of neglect. This was not the retreat of a successful businessman, but rather a place designed for activities that required absolute privacy. The isolation was complete. No neighboring cabins dotted the mountainside, no power lines connected this place to civilization. From his hidden position behind a massive cedar, Frank watched as Grayson emerged from his car, carrying a folding shovel and what appeared to be a flashlight. The producer's expensive suit looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness setting, but his movements were those of a man who knew this terrain intimately. He walked with purpose toward the rear of the cabin, disappearing around the corner with the determined stride of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. Frank's mouth went dry as he realized what he was witnessing. The shovel, the remote location, the desperate urgency in Grayson's movements all pointed towards something that made his blood run cold. 22 years after his daughter's disappearance, he was watching someone who might have been responsible for her death attempting to hide evidence that could finally provide the answers he had sought for so long. The sound of metal striking earth carried through the mountain air, each impact reverberating through Frank's chest like a funeral bell. He fumbled for his cell phone with trembling fingers, grateful for the 2 bars of signal that would allow him to contact the outside world. As he dialed Detective Hayes' number, his eyes never left the corner of the cabin where Grayson had disappeared, each shovelful of dirt representing another moment closer to either vindication or devastating disappointment. The rhythmic scraping of metal against earth grew more frantic as Frank crept closer to the cabin's rear corner. His knees protested against the uneven ground, sharp pine needles and broken twigs digging through his jeans as he belly-crawled behind a fallen log that reeked of decomposition and moss. The mountain air was thin and cold, each breath visible in small puffs that he tried desperately to suppress. Terrified that even the slightest sound might alert Grayson to his presence, from his concealed position, Frank could see the man who had once been his daughter's trusted mentor transformed into something unrecognizable. Grayson's expensive suit jacket hung from a nearby branch, and his white dress shirt was soaked with sweat and dirt. His silver hair, usually perfectly coiffed, hung in disheveled strands across his forehead. The shovel in his hands moved with increasing desperation, each strike against the rocky soil accompanied by labored breathing that echoed through the mountain silence like the gasps of a drowning man. The hole Grayson was digging was approximately 3 feet square, carved into earth that looked as if it had been disturbed before. Dark soil mixed with clay created a muddy paste that clung to the shovel's blade, and Frank noticed that Grayson seemed to know exactly where to dig, as if following a map burned into his memory. The precision was chilling, suggesting this was not the first time the producer had made this journey to this godforsaken place. As the hole deepened, Frank caught glimpses of something wooden buried beneath the surface. Grayson's movements became more careful, almost reverent, as he used his hands to clear away the remaining dirt. The object that emerged was a hand-crafted wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that spoke of careful craftsmanship. The wood was darkened with age and moisture, and brass hinges had turned green with oxidation, giving the container an ancient, tomb-like quality. Frank's breath caught in his throat as Grayson lifted the box from its earthen prison. The producer's hands trembled as he brushed away clinging soil. And even from a distance, Frank could see tears streaming down the man's dirt-streaked face. This was not the careful removal of hidden valuables, but rather the desperate exhumation of something that carried profound emotional weight. Something that had been buried here like a confession that could no longer bear the light of day. The sound of Frank's cell phone buzzing against his chest nearly caused him to cry out in shock. Detective Hayes was returning his call, her voice barely audible through the poor mountain reception. Frank whispered his location and situation with the urgency of a man calling in his own obituary, knowing that his next actions might determine whether he would live to see justice served or become another casualty of secrets too dangerous to uncover. When Frank finally stood and stepped into the clearing, The wooden box clutched in Grayson's arms seemed to glow in the dappled afternoon light filtering through the canopy above. The producer looked up with the expression of a cornered animal, his eyes wild with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Dirt clung to his cheeks like war paint, and his breathing came in sharp, shallow gasps that created small clouds in the cooling mountain air. The transformation from respected businessman to desperate fugitive was complete and terrifying. Grayson's face contorted with emotions that had been suppressed for decades, revealing the monster that had hidden behind academic credentials and professional success. His lips pulled back in a snarl that was barely human, and spittle flew from his mouth as he clutched the wooden box against his chest like a shield or a talisman. Frank felt every muscle in his body coil with tension as he realized how isolated they were, how completely cut off from help or witnesses. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent to human suffering or justice. The silence between them was broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the whisper of wind through the towering pines that surrounded them like silent sentinels. The box in Grayson's arms seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Frank could see that its contents were more than just evidence. This was a shrine to obsession, a repository of guilt and desire that had festered in the darkness for more than 2 decades. The producer's grip on the container was possessive, almost loving, as if he were holding the most precious thing in his world rather than proof of his own damnation. When Grayson reached beneath his jacket, Frank's world slowed to a crawl. The metallic glint of a handgun caught the filtered sunlight, and Frank felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The weapon looked small and insignificant in Grayson's shaking hands, but Frank knew that even a trembling finger could pull a trigger with devastating effect. The producer's eyes had taken on the glassy quality of someone who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Frank's survival instincts, dormant for decades of suburban safety, exploded into action. His thumb found the emergency call button on his phone without conscious thought, sending his GPS coordinates to Detective Hayes, while his eyes never left the gun now pointed directly at his chest. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet, close enough that even an amateur marksman couldn't miss, far enough that Frank had no hope of reaching Grayson before the trigger could be pulled. The mountain clearing became a stage for a confrontation that had been building for 22 years. 2 men stood facing each other across a chasm of grief, guilt, and desperate need for resolution. One held a wooden box containing secrets that could destroy lives, while the other carried the unbearable weight of a father's love for a daughter who would never come home. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Frank could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, so loud that he wondered if Grayson could hear it too. Every detail of the scene burned itself into his memory with crystal clarity. The way afternoon shadows crept across the clearing like dark fingers, the musty scent of decomposing leaves mixed with the sharp odor of Grayson's fear sweat, and the almost supernatural stillness that seemed to hold the entire mountain in suspended animation. The forensics laboratory worked through the night, their analysis revealing microscopic traces of earth clinging to Grayson's shovel that didn't match the soil composition around the cabin. Under powerful microscopes, geologists identified mineral deposits and organic matter consistent with coastal cliff formations, leading Detective Hayes and her team on a dawn expedition to the rugged precipice that overlooked the valley below. The morning mist clung to the mountain peaks like ghostly fingers, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine mixed with the distant salt tang of ocean currents that had carved these cliffs over millennia. Frank and Clara arrived at the site as the sun broke through the cloud cover, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Clara's face was drawn and pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night spent processing the revelations about their daughter's final days. She clutched Frank's arm with desperate intensity, her fingernails leaving small crescents in his jacket sleeve as they watched the forensics team methodically grid-search the area with ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors. The equipment painted an electronic picture of what lay beneath the surface, revealing anomalies in the soil density approximately 50 yards from the cliff's edge. The location was sheltered by a natural windbreak of gnarled pine trees, their branches twisted by decades of coastal storms into shapes that seemed to reach toward the sky in silent supplication. Wild grasses had grown over the disturbed earth, creating a deceptively peaceful meadow that gave no hint of the tragedy buried beneath its surface. When the excavation began, Each shovelful of earth felt like a countdown to either resolution or renewed heartbreak. The soil here was different from the mountain clay around the cabin, rich with decomposed organic matter and threaded with the delicate root systems of wildflowers that had bloomed unknowingly above a makeshift grave. Frank watched each scoop with the intensity of a man witnessing his own judgment, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the worker's careful movements. Clara stood beside him, her body rigid with tension that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and she whispered what might have been prayers, or simply his daughter's name repeated like a mantra. The wind from the ocean below carried the cries of seabirds that wheeled overhead, their calls creating a mournful soundtrack to the systematic unearthing of secrets that had been buried for more than 2 decades. The first evidence of human remains appeared as a fragment of fabric, faded blue denim that emerged from the earth, like a terrible flower blooming in reverse. Frank recognized it immediately as part of the outfit Amelia had been wearing the day she disappeared. The same clothes described in missing person reports that had yellowed with age in police files. The sight of that familiar fabric, now stained with earth and time, sent Clara to her knees with a cry that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Detective Hayes worked with methodical precision, documenting each stage of the excavation with photographs and detailed measurements. Her professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask the gravity of what they were uncovering, and Frank noticed how her jaw tightened when additional evidence emerged. Personal effects that had been lovingly chosen by a teenage girl appeared one by one. A silver necklace Frank had given her for her 16th birthday, a class ring that caught the morning light like a tiny beacon, and the remains of a backpack that had once carried her dreams of college and independence. The skeletal remains that emerged from their earthen tomb were handled with a dignity that Amelia had been denied in death. Each bone was carefully catalogued and photographed, treated with the respect of someone's beloved daughter, rather than merely evidence in a criminal case. Frank found himself studying the forensic anthropologist's face, searching for signs that might indicate how his daughter had died, whether she had suffered, whether her final moments had been filled with the terror that now consumed his own heart. Clara's grief manifested in a keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth itself, a sound of such primal anguish that even the seasoned investigators paused in their work. Frank gathered her into his arms, and they clung to each other with the desperation of survivors of a shipwreck, their tears mixing as they finally, truly, began to mourn their daughter. The waiting was over. The uncertainty that had poisoned their lives for 22 years was finally at an end. But the price of that knowledge felt almost too heavy to bear. The preliminary examination revealed no signs of violence to the bones themselves, suggesting that Amelia's death might have been the result of suffocation or poisoning rather than physical trauma. This clinical detail provided no comfort to her parents, but it did offer the small mercy of hoping that her suffering had been brief. The forensic team worked with quiet efficiency, their movements respectful and deliberate, as they prepared to transport their findings to the laboratory where modern science would attempt to piece together the final chapter of a young woman's life. As the remains were carefully placed into a transport container, Frank felt a profound shift in his understanding of what the past 22 years had meant. The limbo of not knowing had been its own form of torture, but this concrete evidence of loss carried a different kind of pain. It was sharper, more immediate, but also strangely cleaner than the infected wound of uncertainty that had been festering in his soul for more than 2 decades. 3 months after the discovery, Frank and Clara stood on the windswept shore of Cannon Beach, where Amelia had spent countless summer afternoons collecting shells and chasing waves with the carefree abandon of childhood. The Pacific Ocean stretched before them in shades of gray and green, its surface churned by autumn winds that carried the salt spray high onto the rocky outcroppings that punctuated the coastline. Haystack Rock loomed in the distance like an ancient monument, its massive form unchanged by the passage of time that had transformed their lives so completely. Clara held a simple ceramic urn close to her chest, its smooth surface warm against her coat despite the October chill. Inside were Amelia's ashes, finally returned to them after months of legal proceedings and forensic analysis. The weight of the container seemed impossibly light for something that contained all that remained of their vibrant daughter, yet it felt heavier than anything Clara had ever carried. Her fingers traced the engraved nameplate repeatedly, as if memorizing the curves of each letter might somehow preserve more than just her daughter's remains. Frank carried a boombox that looked almost comically outdated against the timeless backdrop of the ocean. The device had been Amelia's, purchased with money from her part-time job at the local bookstore, and it still bore the colorful stickers she had applied with teenage enthusiasm. In his other hand, he held a cassette tape, not the one that had revealed their family's tragedy, but rather a compilation of Amelia's favorite songs that he had carefully recreated from memory and old playlists found in her room. Detective Olivia Hayes approached from the parking area, her professional attire replaced by simple jeans and a windbreaker that fluttered in the coastal breeze. The investigation had officially closed with Grayson's conviction and Marcus's plea agreement. But Hayes had requested permission to attend this private ceremony. The months of working together had forged a connection between them that transcended professional duty, creating a bond built on shared pursuit of justice and mutual respect for Amelia's memory. The beach was nearly deserted except for a few hardy joggers and dog walkers who gave them respectful distance, perhaps sensing the solemnity of what was taking place. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the eternal percussion of waves against sand to create nature's own requiem. The tide was going out, exposing tidal pools that reflected the overcast sky like scattered mirrors broken by the wind. Clara's hands shook as she removed the lid from the urn, releasing a scent that was surprisingly clean and neutral, nothing like the earthy mustiness she had expected. The ashes were finer than sand, almost powder-like, and they caught the wind immediately upon exposure to the air. Some scattered before she was ready, dancing away on invisible currents like tiny gray spirits eager to join the vast expanse of sea and sky. Frank positioned the boombox on a piece of driftwood that had been polished smooth by countless tides, its surface bleached white by salt and sun. When he pressed play, Amelia's favorite song began to flow from the speakers, the melody carried by the wind across the water like a message in a bottle cast into eternity. The music seemed to transform the beach into a cathedral, with the ocean as its altar and the crying gulls as its choir. As the song played, Clara began to pour Amelia's ashes into the wind, watching as they were caught by the ocean breeze and carried out over the waves. Some settled on the foam of incoming waves, becoming part of the sea's eternal dance, while others rose higher, disappearing into the gray sky like prayers ascending to whatever lay beyond human understanding. Each handful released felt like letting go of a piece of her heart, but also like setting something precious free from the earthly bonds that had held it captive. Frank felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter become one with the element she had loved most in life. Amelia had always been drawn to the ocean, spending hours walking these same shores and collecting treasures that the tide had deposited for her discovery. She had talked about living by the sea someday, perhaps in a cottage like the one where they had found Bethany, where she could wake each morning to the sound of waves and fall asleep to their eternal lullaby. When the urn was empty, Frank lifted the cassette tape that contained not evidence of crime, but rather echoes of joy, love, and the innocent enthusiasm that had defined his daughter's too brief life. The plastic felt warm in his palm, and he could almost feel the magnetic tape inside, wound with memories of afternoons spent sharing music and dreams. This tape represented everything that Grayson's obsession had tried to destroy. The pure relationship between a father and daughter, unmarked by manipulation or hidden agendas. He drew his arm back and hurled the cassette as far as his strength would allow, watching as it arced through the air before disappearing beneath the surface of an incoming wave. The ocean accepted this offering without ceremony, swallowing it whole and erasing the last physical remnant of the trauma that had consumed their family for more than 2 decades. The gesture felt simultaneously like destruction and creation, an ending that was also a beginning. Detective Hayes approached them as the final notes of music faded into the sound of wind and waves. Her presence was comforting rather than intrusive, like that of a family friend who had shared their burden and understood the magnitude of what this moment represented. She didn't speak, understanding instinctively that words would only diminish the profound significance of what they had just experienced. The three of them stood in companionable silence as the tide continued its eternal retreat, leaving behind a beach smooth and unmarked, ready for whatever the next tide might bring. The ceremony had lasted less than an hour, but Frank felt as if they had crossed a bridge from one life into another, leaving behind the realm of uncertainty and entering a place where grief could finally take its natural course. As they walked back toward the parking area, Frank and Clara moved with a different rhythm than they had carried for 22 years. Their steps were no longer weighted down by the crushing burden of not knowing, though they still carried the immeasurable sadness of loss. Clara's hand found Frank's, their fingers interlacing with the natural ease of partners who had survived the unthinkable together, and emerged still connected, still capable of facing whatever remained of their shared future. The drive home was quiet but not empty. The silence in their car was no longer the suffocating void of unspoken questions, but rather the peaceful quiet of people who had finally laid their burden down. Frank glanced at Clara periodically, noting how her shoulders had relaxed for the first time in years, how her breathing had deepened into something that resembled actual rest rather than mere survival. Their house, when they finally reached it, looked different in the afternoon light. The rooms that had felt like shrines to frozen time now seemed ready to be lived in again, to be filled with whatever new memories they might be capable of creating together. The healing would take time, perhaps years, but for the first time since October 1990, Frank and Clara Evans could imagine a future that held something more than just endurance. Frank stood at the periphery of the scene, his body trembling not from the mountain chill, but from the anticipation that had been building for 22 years. His eyes were fixed on the box with an intensity that bordered on hypnotic, as if he could will it to reveal its secrets through sheer force of paternal desperation. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, fingernails digging crescents into his palms without his awareness. The brass hinges protested with a metallic groan as Detective Hayes slowly lifted the lid, the sound echoing through the clearing like the opening of a crypt that had been sealed for decades. The smell that emerged was musty and complex, carrying notes of old paper, metal corrosion, and something indefinably organic that made Frank's stomach lurch with primitive revulsion. Inside, nestled like precious relics, lay objects that would forever change everything he thought he knew about his daughter's final days. The cassette tape was the first item Hayes removed, its black plastic surface scratched and worn from handling. The label, written in Amelia's careful handwriting, read, "The Last Song," in purple ink that had faded but remained legible. Frank's heart clenched as he recognized his daughter's distinctive penmanship. Each letter formed with the meticulous care she had applied to everything she considered important. The tape looked so ordinary, so innocuous, yet it represented the key to mysteries that had consumed his family's existence. Beneath the tape lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hours of handling. The leather was deep burgundy, almost black in places where oils from human skin had darkened it over time. When Hayes opened it, the pages crackled with age, releasing the scent of ink and obsession that seemed to permeate the very fibers of the paper. The handwriting inside was cramped and frantic, words scratched across pages with the fevered intensity of someone pouring their soul onto paper in the darkness of night. Frank watched as Hayes's expression changed while reading the journal's contents, her professional composure cracking slightly as the true scope of Grayson's depravity became clear. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and a muscle twitched in her cheek as she absorbed words that revealed a level of violation that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The detective's breathing became controlled and deliberate, a technique Frank recognized from his own attempts to manage overwhelming emotion. The journal entries were dated, beginning months before Amelia's disappearance and continuing sporadically afterward. Each page revealed another layer of Grayson's obsession, documenting his growing fixation on his student with the clinical precision of a predator cataloging his prey. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, becoming increasingly erratic and desperate, as if the author were slowly losing his grip on sanity while documenting his own descent into darkness. Hayes read selected passages aloud for the recording equipment, her voice steady but strained as she gave voice to Grayson's confessions. The teacher had installed surveillance equipment in Amelia's bedroom, hidden cameras that violated her privacy in the most fundamental way possible. The journal contained detailed descriptions of her daily routines, her private moments, and her intimate conversations with friends and family. Grayson had been living a parallel existence, experiencing Amelia's life through the lens of his hidden cameras, while maintaining the facade of a concerned educator. The most devastating revelations concerned Marcus Cole, the young man who had been Amelia's boyfriend, and the police's primary suspect. The journal revealed that Grayson had discovered Marcus's secret drug use and had used this knowledge as a weapon of manipulation. The teacher had forced Marcus into increasingly compromising situations, threatening to destroy the young man's future unless he complied with demands that grew more disturbing with each entry. Frank felt his knees buckle as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. Grayson had been orchestrating events like a puppet master, using Marcus as a tool to isolate Amelia from her support network. The teacher had convinced the young man to create distance between himself and Amelia, all while positioning himself as her confidant and protector. The sick irony was that Grayson had been destroying the very relationship he claimed to want to protect her from. The cassette tape, when finally played through a portable device brought by the forensics team, revealed Amelia's voice speaking across more than 2 decades of silence. Her words, captured in secret during what must have been one of her final conversations with Marcus, painted a picture of a young woman who had begun to understand the web of manipulation surrounding her. She had recorded Marcus's terrified confession about Grayson's blackmail, his desperate explanations of why he had been pulling away from her, and his growing fear that their teacher's obsession was escalating beyond psychological manipulation. Frank's legs gave out completely as he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 22 years. The sound hit him like a physical blow, and he sank to his knees in the damp earth, tears streaming down his face as he absorbed every inflection, every breath that proved she had been alive and fighting until the very end. Her voice carried a maturity and determination that surprised him, revealing a young woman who had been far more perceptive than anyone had realized. The recording captured Amelia's growing awareness that she was in danger, her plans to expose Grayson's crimes, and her determination to protect Marcus from further manipulation. Her voice held no fear, only righteous anger and a steely resolve that reminded Frank painfully of her mother's unwavering sense of justice. She had been preparing to confront her teacher, to demand accountability for his actions, unaware that her courage would ultimately seal her fate. Detective Hayes's voice cut through Frank's emotional haze as she continued reading from the journal's final entries. Grayson's writing became increasingly unhinged as he described his rage at Amelia's defiance, his fury that she had chosen to protect Marcus rather than submit to his control. The entries revealed a man whose obsession had transformed into murderous hatred, someone who saw Amelia's independence as a personal betrayal that demanded ultimate punishment. The forensics team worked with silent efficiency around them, photographing evidence and collecting samples with the methodical precision of professionals who had seen humanity's darkest impulses too many times. Their presence provided a buffer between Frank and the raw horror of what they were uncovering. But nothing could shield him from the devastating realization that his daughter's trust had been weaponized against her. As darkness settled over the mountain clearing, portable generators hummed to life, casting harsh shadows that danced across the cabin's walls like demons celebrating their exposure to light. The wooden box sat empty now, its secrets finally surrendered after decades of silence. But Frank knew that the true horror lay not in what had been hidden, but in the realization that evil had worn a familiar face, had sat at their dinner table, and had accepted their gratitude while planning their daughter's destruction. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.